Bjorn Borg gave Iala the surprise of a lifetime with his most cherished possession, the golden racket. It was an irreplaceable artifact from Sweden's entire tennis history, and the reason he selected her over every other player on the planet will challenge everything you think you know. This moment had no ceremony. It was not a manufactured sponsorship event or a calculated public relations move dreamed up by brand managers in some conference room. What unfolded in that private Stockholm room was an exchange between a 68-year-old Swedish legend, a man who had just survived cancer surgery and stared his own mortality in the face through the pages of a harrowing 2025 autobiography. In addition, a 20-year-old girl from Quezon City, Philippines brought an emotional intensity that people who were there still find hard to describe without their voices trembling. Before this story reaches its emotional peak, you must understand a fundamental truth: the golden racket never originally belonged to Bjorn Borg. It was the very thing that lured a 9-year-old kid in Södertälje, Sweden away from ice hockey and towards 11 Grand Slam titles, 5 straight Wimbledon championships, and a legacy so profound that the sport still uses it as a benchmark for excellence 5 decades later. That racket was the genesis of everything Bjorn Borg became, and he handed it over to Alexandra Iala. Listen closely to every single word that follows, because the reason for this decision will permanently change your perspective on what tennis legends owe to the sport that made them. She pushes herself and capitalizes on her chances. And in tennis, that is precisely how you earn your place in history, which is where a Grand Slam story begins. There are rankings, seedings, and draw sheets based on points earned over several years of high-level play. Then there is the other version, which starts quietly in 1966 in an apartment in Södertälje, Sweden, where a man named Rune Borg won a table tennis tournament and was given a prize that, unknown to him, would change the trajectory of the entire sport. That prize was a wooden tennis racket painted in a warm, cozy amber with a gut-strung frame that his relatives would almost always describe as golden. It wasn't golden in a metaphorical sense. It actually seemed to radiate color, catching the soft afternoon light through the apartment windows with a warmth that made the object feel special. Its significance was cemented when someone deliberately placed it into his hands. Rune gave it to his 9-year-old son Bjorn without any ceremony, without instructions or a grand purpose, and without any real belief that the gesture would be momentous beyond the immediate thrill a child feels when receiving something new. He simply gave it to him. It was the casual, unthinking kindness of a father sharing something with his son, who would go on to forge his own bond with it. What transpired next is the stuff of one of sport's most legendary origin stories. Bjorn Borg took that racket to the wall of his Södertälje apartment building and hit balls against the concrete for hours that bled into days that stretched into months of solitary, obsessive repetition. There was no coach, no formal program, and no junior pipeline to guide his development through the well-established Swedish tennis system. It was just a concrete wall, a boy, and the golden racket his dad won at a table tennis tournament. By age 13, Borg had been selected for the Swedish national junior team. By the time he was 15, he had won his first Davis Cup match, the youngest player in the history of Sweden to accomplish such a feat. At 17 years old, he won his first French Open title. 5 consecutive Wimbledon championships followed from 1976 to 1980. He amassed 6 Roland Garros crowns for a total of 11 Grand Slams before he retired at the young age of 26. It was a retirement so premature that the world of tennis couldn't quite bring itself to accept it. All of it, from the Davis Cup wins and championship trophies to the cultural sensation of Borgomania, where teenage fans screamed his name with a fanaticism never before directed at a tennis player, was part of his journey. Through it all, Borg held on to the golden racket. It was never displayed in a museum. It was never used in an advertisement. It was never seen in any of the official tennis halls of fame that would one day honor his career. It remained a personal, private treasure, the one item that predated everything else and therefore meant more than all that came after. "That racket is where it all started for me," Borg would tell the journalist who helped write his 2025 autobiography, Heartbeats. "Before any coaching, before Wimbledon, there was only a wall and that racket. I could never give it away because that would feel like giving away my own beginning." He held on to that conviction for almost 68 years. A match in Miami featuring Alexandra Iala made him rethink a lifetime of holding on to that belief. Bjorn Borg was diagnosed with cancer in 2023. The news rearranged every calculation he had about time priorities and his legacy. It was an aggressive form of prostate cancer that required immediate surgery. It was serious enough that the medical team spoke in language that offered no comforting certainties. True to his character, Borg rarely discussed this with anyone. This was, after all, the man they called the Iceman, whose emotional composure under the greatest competitive strain defined his career, a career marked by a complete absence of any visible agitation. His Davis Cup opponents often described the unnerving experience of playing him as uniquely frightening, not because of his powerful shots, but because of his complete lack of expression. There was no rage, no joy, not a single detectable emotional cue of any kind. There was only the steady, relentless performance of an opponent who seemed so detached from the moment that nothing his rivals did could disrupt that profound calmness, even during a changeover. He approached the cancer diagnosis without any public show of emotion. The emergency surgery happened quietly. His recovery in 2024 was a prolonged and physically grueling ordeal, one that unfolded entirely hidden from the public eye. No one had any idea, not the tennis world, not the press, not his old colleagues, nor the legions of fans who had tracked his career since the early 1970s. Borg had spent the decades since his retirement cultivating such a complete solitude that the silence of his illness was indistinguishable from the silence of his wellness. Yet the operation changed something deep inside him, a fundamental part of him that his legendary composure could no longer mask because cancer had finally broken Bjorn Borg. The record shows that very little had ever truly broken Borg before. But confronting his own mortality, a reality that a serious illness brings into sharp focus, forced him to grapple with questions that the distractions of his competitive life had always kept at bay. Beyond the statistics, what was the true significance of his career? What had he brought to the sport he helped define? What was there left for him to accomplish? Not for his career or for money, but on a human level, a chance to pass on something real and meaningful to the next generation of tennis. Long after the last of his contemporaries had permanently hung up their rackets, he began to write his memoir during his recovery. Published in 2025, the book revealed his cancer diagnosis with a directness that stunned readers who had expected the same emotional restraint that had defined every public statement of his adult life. In its pages, he described the preparations for the surgery. He highlighted that unique kind of fear that sets in the moment the medical team stops offering words of comfort. He recounted lying in the recovery room, his mind clear despite the anesthesia, thinking about the golden racket sitting in storage and wondering what would become of them after he was gone. That racket was where it all began for me. Borg told the writer helping with his 2025 memoir that before Wimbledon, before the coaches, there was nothing but that one racket and a wall. I never wanted to show it to anyone. It felt like I was giving away the very start of my journey. He held on to that belief for 68 years, until a match he won in Miami forced him to question everything he had assumed. It was a conviction built over a lifetime of holding on. Then in 2023, Bjorn Borg was diagnosed. The diagnosis reordered every calculation he had ever made about time priorities and what he would leave behind. It was an aggressive form of prostate cancer, serious enough to require immediate surgical intervention. It was so serious that the medical staff spoke in terms that left no room for comforting reassurances. True to form, Borg shared this news with almost no one. The man whose emotional stillness under the most intense competitive pressure had earned him the nickname the Iceman had built an entire career on a complete lack of visible turmoil. His Davis Cup opponents once described him as uniquely terrifying, not for the power of his shots, but because of his utter lack of expression. There was never any anger, any elation, not a single detectable emotional signal. There was only the relentless methodical output of an opponent so detached from his own performance that this unsettling calm would completely consume the changeover. Then came the cancer diagnosis, which he kept entirely private. An emergency surgery was performed quickly. The recovery in 2024 was long and arduous, and it happened completely out of the public view. The tennis community, the media, his former peers, and the countless fans who had followed him since the 1970s remained completely in the dark. For decades after he retired, Borg maintained such a profound privacy that his silence while ill was no different from his silence while he was well. But the surgery changed something fundamental inside of him, something his famous stoicism could no longer conceal. Cancer had finally broken through Bjorn Borg's defenses, and the record books show that virtually nothing had ever broken Borg before. But staring down death, a prospect that a grave illness forces upon you, makes you confront the very questions that the hustle of a career had allowed you to avoid. What was the real meaning of his career apart from all the wins and titles? What had he truly given to the sport he helped revolutionize? And what was left for him to do? Not in a professional sense or for financial gain, but as a human being looking to pass something authentic and valuable onto the next generation of players. After all the players of his generation had long since left the court for good, he began writing down his story as he recovered. The autobiography published in 2025 revealed his cancer diagnosis with a candor that shocked his readers, who had grown accustomed to the emotional discipline that marked every other public statement he had ever made. He walked the reader through his preparations for the operation. He pinpointed the specific kind of dread that takes over when the doctor stopped trying to reassure you. He described lying in a recovery room with a mind sharpened by the fading anesthetic, realizing that history isn't truly passed down through publicly displayed awards. Those trophies represent recognition, grace, and an importance that is certainly deserved. But they belong to institutions. They sit in museums, display cases, and halls of fame viewed by visitors through glass walls that prevent any real personal connection. Real history travels through objects passed from hand to hand through the singular, irreplaceable act of a personal treasure moving from one life to another, carrying with it not just the object itself, but the entire weight of the stories that came before it. Its meaning is embedded in the life that was built around it, in the person it helped to create. Model Sura. When Borg passed a golden racket to a 9-year-old boy, it was a transfer that led to 11 Grand Slam titles. Bjorn Borg, whose championship-filled career reshaped the very possibilities of sport, held onto that same racket for 68 years, an object that had been with him since his solitary childhood days playing ice hockey. He faced it all without flinching: the triumphs at Wimbledon, a battle with cancer surgery, an early retirement and the long road back, and a direct confrontation with mortality brought on by serious illness. Every layer of meaning was intentionally and fully understood as it passed into the hands of Aya Alexandra. So, what was the real significance? It wasn't about commerce, nor was it some shallow symbol for the media, even though the press was drawn to it. What did this gesture truly mean at its core? On what level do these kinds of exchanges actually happen? It suggests that Borg recognized in Ya the same essential quality his father's racket had once given him: something beyond skill, better equipment, or the raw athletic talent that coaches can spot and develop in junior programs. It was the quality a 9-year-old Bjorn showed against a concrete wall for hours on end, day after day, for months of lonely practice, without any coaching, formal support, or anyone telling him his efforts would ever amount to more than the simple satisfaction of the act itself. It's a conviction that is born from within. It is the inner framework of someone who has already arrived, someone who doesn't require external approval to keep going, because the work itself is its own reason. This is the ability to operate without an audience, without praise, and without any guarantee that all the accumulated effort will ever pay off in a way that matches the investment. For 7 years at this Rafa Nadal Academy, Isa demonstrated that very same excellence, pushing through training sessions no one outside of Mallorca saw, leading to results the tennis world wouldn't see until 2025 in Miami. The self-reliant, independent work ethic that a 9-year-old once directed at a concrete wall was now in a 20-year-old aimed at courts that would eventually give everything back with interest. Borg recognized this from an insider's perspective, as someone who had spent 68 years knowing precisely how that quality feels and how it looks from the outside. Passing the golden racket to Ya sends a message far beyond just the two of them, suggesting that the greats of any generation have a direct duty to the ones that follow. Not just the comfortable passive debt of being a role model, but rather the profound and active debt of deliberately finding someone who possesses the same core trait that made you and then giving them something truly irreplaceable. Imagine how the journey of that quality is perceived by every young athlete in the Philippines who sees this story and takes part in the global conversation about tennis. Think of every junior player training in Southeast Asia and the Pacific in systems that receive only a fraction of the institutional money directed toward American and European pathways. Borg's gesture communicates something on a level deeper than mere inspiration. It acts as a confirmation, an affirmation that the greatest of one generation have a tangible responsibility to the next. Not just the comfortable passive debt of being a role model, but rather the profound and active debt of deliberately finding someone who possesses the same core trait that made you, and then giving them something truly irreplaceable. Imagine how the journey of that quality is perceived by every young athlete in the Philippines who sees this story and takes part in the global conversation about tennis. Think of every junior player training in Southeast Asia and the Pacific, in systems that receive only a fraction of the institutional money directed toward American and European pathways. Borg's gesture communicates something on a level deeper than mere inspiration. It acts as a confirmation and affirmation that the greatest of one generation have a tangible responsibility to the next. Not just the comfortable passive debt of being a role model, but rather the profound and active debt of deliberately finding someone who possesses the same core trait that made you and then giving them something truly irreplaceable. Imagine how the journey of that quality is perceived by every young athlete in the Philippines watching this story unfold, and for every junior player in Southeast Asian and Pacific systems that receive only a fraction of the institutional money funneled to American and European routes. Borg's gesture communicates something on a level deeper than mere inspiration. It acts as a confirmation that the greatest of one generation have a tangible responsibility to the next. not just the comfortable passive debt of being a role model, but rather the profound and active debt of deliberately finding someone who possesses the same core trait that made you and then giving them something truly irreplaceable. Imagine how the journey of that quality is perceived by every young athlete in the Philippines watching this story unfold, and for every junior player in Southeast Asian and Pacific systems that receive only a fraction of the institutional money funneled to American and European roots. Borg's gesture communicates something on a level deeper than mere inspiration. It acts as a confirmation and affirmation that the greatest of one generation have a tangible responsibility to the next, not just the comfortable passive debt of being a role model, but rather the profound and active debt of deliberately finding someone who possesses the same core trait that made you and then giving them something truly irreplaceable. Imagine how the journey of that quality is perceived by every young athlete in the Philippines watching this story unfold, and for every junior player in Southeast Asian and Pacific systems that receive only a fraction of the institutional money funneled to American and European roads. Borg's gesture communicates something on a level deeper than mere inspiration. It acts as a confirmation and affirmation that the greatest of one generation have a tangible responsibility to the next. It's not just the simple debt of being a comfortable and passive role model, but rather the profound and active debt of deliberately finding someone who possesses the same core trait that made you and then giving them something truly irreplaceable. Imagine how the journey of that quality is perceived by every young athlete in the Philippines watching this story unfold, and for every junior player in Southeast Asian and Pacific systems that receive only a fraction of the institutional money funneled to American and European roots. Borg's gesture carries a message that resonates on a level more fundamental than simple inspiration. It serves as a reminder that the greatest athletes of any generation have a genuine responsibility to those who follow a debt that isn't settled by just being a passive and comfortable role model. And yet, the deliberate and personal effort of finding a mentor who embodies the qualities that shaped you and forming a true connection is absolutely invaluable. That is the kind of quality that defines the path for every single young athlete in the Philippines. When you place this gesture within the global tennis conversation where institutional funding for facilities and systems is overwhelmingly channeled toward Europe and America, its ingrained message connects on a much more profound level for every young athlete in Southeast Asia. You see,